Great, well, thanks for the introduction. So I'm going to talk today about some work that I did as a postdoc with Danny Williamson in Exeter last year. And we're interested in looking at spatial-temporal boundary condition uncertainty through the deglaciation. And this joint work with Lauren Gregoire, who's a paleo modeler from the University of Leeds. And the purpose of this work was basically as a 6-month feasibility study to see whether we can answer any of the questions that paleo modelers are interested in by using statistical methods. So first, well, what is an ice sheet model? So these are computer models which paleoscientists use to study the deglaciation. We don't have complete observations of what happened over the past several thousand years, so therefore paleo modelers use these models to understand some of the processes that are involved and how the melting ice affects the climate. So this is just a standard type of computer model, so we have a set of input parameters and these govern things such as physical processes in the ice sheet. But as well as this, we also have an extremely high dimensional boundary condition. So this consists of spatial-temporal time series of both temperature and precipitation fields. And in order to run our ice sheet model, we need to specify the ice sheet input parameters and also this high-dimensional spatial-temporal field. And as we're interested in what happens to the ice sheet over several thousand years, this is an extremely high dimension. And so the way the paleo community currently deal with this is by taking the output of another climate model and just plugging in the spatial fields of temperature and precipitation from these other models, and then basically just varying the ice sheet parameters and mostly just keeping the boundary condition fixed. So what we want to do is come up with a way that allows us to actually explore more plausible and much more plausible sets of boundary conditions. So develop a model that allows us to vary these in a way that's consistent with historical observations, and then we can better explore, well, what's happening in the ice sheet model, what's down to the ice sheet parameters, what's down to the temperature boundary condition. And then hopefully we can do something like history matching, calibration, and start to cut down the uncertainty due to the boundary condition and reproduce the historical observations of the ice sheet with our computer model. So first, I've got a few slides about the deglaciation, about ice sheet models. So what we're interested in this project is just the last 21,000 years. So this was, so 21,000 years ago was the last glacial maximum, when the end of the last ice age, essentially, when the ice started melting. And at this stage, we have this ice sheet covering about half of North America, and also an ice sheet over the northern half of Europe. And then over the next 15,000 years or so, the ice sheets over North America and Europe retreat, and we're basically left with just the modern day ice sheet in Greenland. So we're interested in the time period from this maximum of 21,000 years ago up to when the ice sheet is mostly retreated at 6,000 years ago. And in this project we just focus on what's happened in North America. So we know that several things relating to the globe's climate changed over the past 21,000 years. So we have changes in things like solar insolation, the level of carbon dioxide increases, and then of course this affects things like the sea level. And there's also some temperature changes that we know happened. So the grey line here is what's happening in Antarctica, so we have some gradual changes. But what we're interested in is what happens in Greenland, so we have much more rapid changes here. And as we're interested in what's happening in North America, this is an important change to look at. So paleoclimatologists are interested in things like, well, we know there's a rapid warming here. What impact did this have on the North American ice sheet at certain times? We know there was a sea level rise, but how much of this can be attributed to various factors? And the grand aim is that if we understand exactly what happened during the last ice age, if there's rapid melting in the future, for example, the Antarctic Greenland ice sheets disappearing over the next 100 years or so, well, the idea is that if we understand what happened in the past, this may be able to better inform our predictions for the future. So this is just a basic picture of what kind of happens with our ice sheet model. So we first run a general circulation model, so these are expensive climate models. that capture atmospheric physics, stuff that's happening in the ocean, so parameterized by PDEs and approximations to them. So these take quite a long time to run on a supercomputer, so we don't have too many of these runs, but we can take precipitation and temperature spatial fields from these, and then we plug these into our ice sheet model. So we're looking at this ice sheet model called Glimmer, which simulates the evolution of the North American ice sheet, and then gives output that looks like this. So we just have the thickness of the ice over North America, and this is just at a snapshot in time. So as well as the precipitation and temperature spatial fields going in from our general circulation model, we also have 7 input parameters that control things such as the friction at the base of the ice sheet, control things how quickly it's allowed to move. So we have to specify spatial fields of these 2 attributes, but also we have to specify these ice sheet parameters. And not only is our problem highly dimensional in the input space, we also have high dimensional output space. So we get a field like this every 100 years through a deglaciation, and there's about 30,000 grid boxes here. We can run an ensemble of this model in about a day. So this is much faster, but we can run these types of models. These are more sort of thing where we can do, say, 10, 20 runs over the course of a few months. So just to again reiterate the size of our input space, this time series plot is just the temperature over our time scale at a single spatial location. And then every single point in this plot, it then has a 48 by 37 spatial field associated with it. In reality, we also have one for precipitation, but we're just going to focus on temperature to make things a little easier. But even with this, we still have over 300 million values that we need to specify as an input for our model. So understandably, it's quite attractive to just use existing climate output that you have. There exists some transient simulations of the last several thousand years, and we can just take the temperature and precipitation fields from these and then just plug them into our ice sheet model and just run that. Of course, these are very expensive to run, so we do only have a very limited number of them. And in this project, we just have 16 of these from a couple of sources. Of course, the problem is that this is just an ensemble of opportunity. We haven't been able to run it. These models have their own input parameters, which aren't necessarily particularly well tuned, and they may have been tuned to things such as the modern day climate rather than getting what happens through the deglaciation right. So there's no guarantee that these actually represent the historical observations of temperature. But of course, the ice sheet model is extremely sensitive to what happens in its boundary conditions. If temperature is too cold, then of course we're not going to be able to replicate the melting of the ice. So it's key to actually be able to specify a boundary condition that is coherent with the historical observations. And that is illustrated by this next plot. So our 16 climate ensemble members are shown by the blue lines, and we have some historical observations in a couple of locations here. So the left-hand plot is in Greenland. This is from ice core observations, and on the right is Alaska. And here again we're seeing this key feature. In Greenland, we have this rapid warming around 14,500 years ago, where the temperature spikes by about 15, 16 degrees over the course of about 300 years. And this isn't really captured by our climate ensemble. There's one run that does a bit, but it starts off far too warm. There's also this key sudden cooling in Greenland as well, which the climate ensemble can't capture at all. And on top of this, there's a problem that our ensemble starts off far too warm anyway. We have similar problems in Alaska. Our climate ensemble is biased extremely cold compared to our observations. And you can look at other locations around the world, and some of them obviously do match. But these are the 2 sets of spatial locations we have that are closest to what we're interested in. And we clearly don't have good matching temperatures from our boundary condition. So we only have a limited number of these spatial sets of temperature observations. So we have Greenland and Alaska, which are the only 2 we have on land. The rest are all ocean-based. And where we're interested in is what's happening in North America, but we don't have any historical temperature observations for this. So we have to somehow use the ones that we do have to try and work out the temperatures here. So we have extreme sparsity in space of our observations, but also there's sparsity in time. So the Greenland ice core records are fairly good. We have observations every 100 years or so, but in some other locations we might have 1,500, 2,000 years between temperature observations. So this is something that we have to consider when we're thinking about trying to fit a model to this. So let's assume we have run an ice sheet model, we get some output. We do have some knowledge of what happens to the ice sheet through the deglaciation. Our ice sheet model gives ice thickness as an output, and we don't have direct observations of this. We do have a couple of proxies that we can look at. So we know up to some uncertainty what the total ice volume of this sheet was during the deglaciation, and we also have a reconstruction of the extent of the ice sheet. That's pictured here. This is just at one time point. It's about 11,000 years ago. And we have these binary ice-no ice observations. So the white areas are where we have ice, and the grey is where we don't. And these are reconstructed by looking at all these black dots, which are moraines left behind by the retreating ice sheet. And then in this 2004 paper, they've gone through and reconstructed where they think ice was based on data in these moraines. So that's something we can use to assess the performance of our ice sheet model. So that's the background to the problem. So what we want to do, what our aim was for this project, was to define a statistical model that allows us to generate sets of temperature boundary conditions which give past climates which are consistent with the observations that we do have. So we want to improve on the existing boundary conditions because these don't particularly well match in a number of places, and because we only have a small number of these and can't obtain more. So we want to be able to quickly generate a plausible set of boundary conditions and then start running our model at these and then doing our usual things such as emulation, history matching to try and understand better what's happening when we vary the boundary conditions. So one thing we could just do would be to just simply fit a Gaussian process to the observations we have. This can be done spatially and temporally. But we don't do this initially. Our observations are extremely sparse. They're biased in certain ways. We only have a couple of observations over land, so that will cause problems if we try to model what's happening over continents. And also we're going to do this in such a way that we exploit the information that we do have from our climate ensemble. Although it doesn't match perfectly, it's still governed by all the physics of the climate. So there'll be patterns in there which we can use to help us define a model that can match the observations better. So that's basically the idea. We're going to define a model for a boundary condition and then jointly sample values of the ice sheet model parameters and of our boundary condition, and then start emulating aspects, history matching to our ice sheet observations of the volume and the extent. So that's basically what the rest of the talk is going to look at. So first, a very quick slide on high-dimensional emulation, because Danny mostly covered this sort of thing yesterday. But the way this is commonly done is to project our ensemble output onto a low-dimensional basis, usually the SVD basis, and from this we can then emulate the coefficients. And then we tend to try and rotate the basis because we always find that the SVD basis itself isn't good for representing the observations. And we minimize this thing again that Danny talked about. So this isn't too important for my talk. And then once we've got emulators, then we can start history matching based on the ice observations. And again, this is something that's come up in a few talks this week. So I'm just going to highlight we have this multivariate implausibility here where Z is an observation vector. And then we rule out implausible points and get this not ruled out yet, or NROI space. And this is quite a powerful tool to perform in multiple waves, so that's what we're going to do later. So, yeah, the main aim of this project and this talk was to model this high-dimensional boundary condition. And we want to be able to define it with a small number of coefficients, thereby reducing the dimension. So first we assume that we have this bold T. So this represents our full spatial-temporal temperature boundary condition. So we've just stacked all of the dimensions into a single vector. And then we want to model this given some vector of coefficients. And we say this is a multivariate normal distribution centered at some mean vector, which is centered, so this is centered at this mean vector, dependent on the coefficients, and then has some error structure. And here we've imposed this Kronecker structure in space and time just to make subsequent calculations more tractable. So there are three key components to our mean function, to our h of c. So first, we average across our climate ensemble, and this gives us a spatial temporal field, and we call this mu. So while it doesn't, while our ensemble doesn't necessarily match our historical observations everywhere, it still contains some useful trends, like there's still a general warming over the 21,000 years, so we use this as a baseline for our model. And then we add linear combinations of a small number of basis vectors which represent temporal variability, and that's these Tj. And then we also do the same, we add a small number of basis vectors which represent some spatial variability. And then we just have this nt plus ns coefficients that we need to set, and from that we can generate a full spatial temporal field. So we also have these temperature observations of the past, which I showed pictures of earlier, and we call this zt, and we assume that this is also a normal distribution centered at our boundary condition and with some other variance matrix. But due to the large sparsity that we have, we only observe a subset of this, and we denote this zt obs. So the key thing to do at this stage is how do we select these basis vectors? So essentially what we want to do is combine the information that we have from the ensemble in such a way that allows us to get closer to the historical observations of temperature. And this is similar to stuff that Danny talked about yesterday. We want to rotate the basis so that we highlight key features which are useful for explaining observations. So we're going to derive these from the climate ensemble because we hope that they contain some useful physical patterns, and we want our boundary condition to somehow respect the physics. So one thing we could do is find the SVD basis across the whole spatial temporal ensemble. This is quite expensive due to the dimensions, and also it limits our flexibility because we only have 16 basis vectors, and explaining the whole variability, this will induce correlations between very far apart time periods, so this turned out to not be a very good way to go. So we're going to take a sequential approach, and we're first going to select some temporal basis vectors, and then given these, we're going to try and explain the remaining variability with some spatial vectors. And as always, we'll use rotations to optimize it. So first, we've already got the ensemble mean in our boundary conditions, so we basically center our climate ensemble and have this tau mu left over. So in order to select the temporal basis vectors, we first select a subset of spatial locations where we have temperature observations. So these are places where we can actually compare to historical observations. We donate this with subscript I. We calculate the basis of this via the singular value decomposition as usual, and then perform a rotation. So this is much clearer by example. So here I've selected just the time series in Greenland. So these are our 16 ensemble members, just in that single location. We can find the mean of the ensemble and then center it. So these are our this is our centered ensemble, and we can calculate the singular value decomposition of this, and this gives us some basis vectors, which are shown here. And then if we want to, we can rotate this and get different basis vectors. So we optimize based on being able to reconstruct the observations in Greenland. So where this comes in useful, we can show that each of these basis vectors is a linear combination of these ensemble members. So therefore, defining coefficients for these can therefore be written in terms of the ensemble. So by defining a small number of coefficients for these few basis vectors, we can then map this back to 16 coefficients on our climate ensemble. And therefore, so this allows us, even though we've only considered one location, we can write, we get coefficients for the time series in Greenland, and then we can just expand this back to all spatial locations by just using the same coefficients. So we have, essentially we have a linear combination of these, and then we basically just remove the dependency on those, remove the subscript of those spatial locations, and take linear combinations of the full spatial ensemble, which is described in all of that, but that's not important. Essentially, this is a mechanism for allowing us to combine our climate ensemble in a way that allows us to match the historical observations in a small set of chosen locations. And by basically inverting the SVD, we can then get full spatial temporal fields from this. So we could have just specified linear combinations of the ensemble rather than going through this whole defining some temporal basis vectors. But that would need more coefficients. So we have our n equals 16 ensemble members, but we can basically achieve the same thing just by using 2 or 3 basis vectors by doing this sort of thing. And since we've ended up with linear combinations of the full spatial temporal fields, this will hopefully be retaining some useful correlations from our ensemble. So given that we've chosen some temporal basis vectors, we then have some best coefficient that gave the best match in, say, Greenland, and then we can remove this from our ensemble, and we essentially have a residual that we haven't yet explained. So we want to use some spatial basis vectors to try and explain this. And at this stage, we assume that we've taken care of as much temporal variability as we can. So we're going to remove this aspect of it here and just average across time. So now we just have 16 spatial fields representing what we haven't yet explained. And again, we calculate the SVD basis and rotate and try to represent the remaining variability in the observations as well as possible. And we only do this for a subset of our known locations because we don't want to overfit our model. So we fit it to a few of them and then basically use the remaining ones for diagnostics, make sure that we're actually predicting the temperatures reasonably well outside of the locations that we've actually optimized for. So we do this and we get some spatial vectors, and then we just repeat these at every time point. These are basically there to try and correct spatial biases that we've somehow induced, or that were already present in the climate ensemble. Again, it's heated with a picture. So given the temporal vectors I chose in Greenland, I then I then average across time and take the spatial SVD and find some vectors that help me get closer to my temporal observations. And the first one it chooses here has this positive patch in Alaska, which makes sense because we saw previously that our climate ensemble is far too cold in Alaska. So having a coefficient that allows us to increase this is a good thing to have. But obviously this is derived from the climate ensemble, so increasing this, although this is correlated to other things. But we've got a reasonably smooth field here, which again was the aim because we're trying to retain some level of correlation and physicality from the ensemble. So given that we have some basis vectors. So when we have a set of coefficients which we can use to give linear combinations of our basis vectors. But obviously we could set these at anything and they won't necessarily lead to plausible historical temperatures. And we don't want to run our ice sheet model at just any boundary condition. We want it to at least be plausible based on the observations. So therefore we define a coefficient space that we're allowed to sample from by history matching the mean vector that we have to the observations that we have. Essentially this just proceeds as history matching normally does. We rule out runs if they're deemed to be too far away from the observations. So this gives us basically a set of coefficients that we're allowed to run our boundary condition at. And then finally, we defined this distribution for our boundary condition. So we have the mean. We haven't yet done anything with the variance. So to generate the final setting of the boundary condition, which we can run our model at, we sample of a value of C from the space of points that we just defined where we're allowed to run it, and then sample from this distribution, which due to the dimensionality and due to the missing observations, we can't do this directly. So we have to condition on these, and we can basically write this like that, and then sample from this numerically. And that gives us a boundary condition T. Okay, so that's a very quick summary of how we actually fit the model. So now I'm going to actually apply it to our ice sheet model. But before we do so, we need to make a couple of simplifications or just adjustments that actually allow us to solve this problem. So we have quite long temporal domains, so there's quite a lot of variability here. And we found that if we just tried to describe all this variability with just temporal vectors over the whole domain, then this didn't really work. So we split things up into 3 separate time periods. And so we'll have a separate basis in each of the 3 time periods for now. And this basically turns out to allow us to more flexibly model what's going on. And we're also going to reduce the dimensionality a bit. We're just going to look at 100-year averages rather than trying to reproduce a temperature every single year and month, which is, well, it's the sensible thing to do because the observations are roughly on this timescale anyway, and it's commonly what paleo people do with glimmer anyway. So this is just a repeat of what we had before almost. So we use Greenland to select our temporal basis vectors because we're really interested in this spike, which doesn't really show up in our in all the existing GCM runs. So we make sure we have that there, and then we fit spatial vectors for each of the 3 time periods based on this. So initially we had 2 spatial vectors for each time period, then ended up adding a 3rd for the middle one because we found that we were getting quite cold temperatures in North America, and from discussions with the paleoclimatologists, well, they thought this was too cold, so we went back and added a new basis vector, which, if we set the coefficient for this one as 0, then we still get the cold temperatures, but we can now also achieve warmer temperatures, which they believe is slightly more realistic. So in total, we have our 6 temporal basis vectors and 7 spatial. So combining these with the ice sheet parameters, we now have a 20-dimensional input space. And now we can jointly vary the ice sheet parameters and the coefficients, and that gives us a varying boundary condition. So now we have this, now we do the history matching to define our coefficient space. And then we can draw samples from our space of the ice sheet parameters and the space of the coefficients, and then run our ice sheet model with these, get the output, and then emulate the output and start history matching. So we're going to perform a few waves of this to hopefully start cutting out the really bad runs and zooming in on the good regions of this space. We're going to design 500 member ensembles. So at wave 1 we just do a space fill-in design from the full space, and thereafter we do a design within the current NROI space. Before we can actually history match, you may remember that Glimmer gives output as thickness, so it's in meters, and we have observations for the volume, which we can just emulate as a univariate Gaussian process. We also have observations which are binary, so we need a way that can compare the distance between the thickness of the ice sheet and binary spatial observations. And there's a number of ways we could have done this. We could have done something probabilistic, use some sort of binomial distribution, but in the end we basically, so we decide to emulate the ice sheet thickness as normal. We project onto a basis, we emulate the coefficients on this basis, and then project back up. And this gives us an emulated field of thickness, and then we just convert this to 0, 1 output using some threshold. This is what's been done in the paleo community in the past. And then using this, we can define some implausibility measure for our binary observations. And essentially, we just count the number of boxes that are different between the observations and our reconstruction of them, which is really just a placeholder for a better way to do this, but we were kind of running out of time at this point. And I should point out, this isn't just, oh, we did this and it might work. We did test it on the model runs that we have. It seemed to classify runs correctly. And it's similar to a metric that the paleo community have used. And yeah, the results seem to validate quite well. So we have our 500 member ensemble at wave 1. And here are some plots of what's happening at 21,000 years ago. So the top frame shows the proportion of the ensemble that contains ice in each grid box. So the dark red areas are where we always have ice, and then these blue areas are places where we sometimes have ice. This second panel shows our binary observations, so we have whites where we have ice, green where we don't, and this is just a basic comparison. So this red area here in Alaska is where the observations say we should have ice, but our model doesn't have ice. Apparently the paleo people weren't really interested in that. This region here, where we have too much ice, is something that we are interested in. We want this southern extent to be roughly right. So we select this region here and decide to build emulators just for this region. We could emulate the entire spatial output, all 30,000 grid boxes, but we decided this wasn't really worth it. There's a lot of places where nothing much happens, where we always have ice. So we decided to just focus our resources on certain areas where we think we can make an improvement. So at wave 1, we build a univariate Gaussian process emulator for the ice sheet volume at 21,000 years ago, and we emulate a couple of regions that we're interested in, and then evaluate those using our binary implausibility measure. So we cut down the space, we get down to about 5% of our ice sheet parameter times coefficient space. That's not really important. So within this NROI space, we then take a new sample of 500 runs from of the ice sheet parameters and the boundary condition parameters, and run Glimmer again. So first we can check, like, have we actually done something sensible? Have we accurately ruled runs out? So this plot shows the volume through the deglaciation of the North American ice sheet. The grey lines are the runs that we had at wave 1, and the green lines are the runs that we have now at wave 2. And this black dot and error bar show where the observations are. So we've managed to cut down the spread of runs at wave 1. And also with history matching on this region that we had here, at wave 1 we had a lot of runs that had too much ice along this southwest extent, but now at wave 2 we've mostly got rid of those. So it seems to validate that what we're doing is at least sensible. We're cutting down space, we're cutting down the right regions of space. So now we kind of just repeat the whole process again. So at wave 2 we decide to emulate the volume at multiple different time points, and these are the ones that are shown on this plot. So we want 21,000 years ago, 14,000 years ago and 10,000 years ago, because up to now we haven't really got any points that have been melting quickly enough to have a correct volume here. So we want to see if we can actually get some runs that pass through all of these. And we also pick some different regions at different times that we want to emulate, again based on similar arguments. We don't want to emulate the whole thing because that's a waste of time, so we're just going to emulate some of the edges where we think we can rule out things. For example, here there's generally far too much ice, so let's see if we can get rid of some of these things. And we do this at a few different time points. And so then based on emulators for the ice volume and regions again, we can cut down space again, and now we're down to about 1%. And again we sample a new ensemble of 500 members from this space. And now this is the yellow lines. So we've not really reduced the spread at the start very much, but now we've got a much narrower spread of what's happening from about 10,000 years ago onwards. And now we have some runs that actually do pass each of our volume constraints, although there is a caveat that they tend to be right for the wrong reasons. They melt quickly enough, but it's a slightly wrong part of the ice sheet that's melting. But, well, so we haven't completely identified one that does the right thing quite yet. But it's a work in progress. Here's just some more plots of the ice sheet at wave 3. So the top half is the proportion of boxes containing ice at different times, and the bottom half shows thickness. And then these red lines, if you can see them, is the ice sheet extent. So we're doing quite well at 21,000 years ago. By about 12,000 years ago, we've maybe started melting a bit too quickly, and again at 9,000 years ago. But again, we've cut down a lot of space. We don't expect the space that leads to accurate ice sheets to be particularly big, so there's probably several more waves of history matching that could be done. There's lots of other outputs we can actually match to. So the final thing I'm going to quickly talk about. So I've tried to show that we can history match in this manner. We can join the history match our ice sheet parameters and the coefficients for our boundary condition. But what do the boundary conditions actually look like? Are we actually constraining the uncertainty on these? So we can go back to the plots we had near the start of what's happened in Greenland, Alaska, and now I've also added North America. And then the grey lines here are our 500 wave 1 boundary conditions. So for Greenland, we've got a much better match for the observations than the climate ensemble was. We're roughly the right temperature at the start. We can actually capture this rapid warming and cooling event, and we also have sensible temperatures at the end. Alaska is also much improved. Our boundary conditions can capture the right temperatures here. In North America, we can't actually compare to observations because we don't have them. And for the first 6,000 years, we're colder than the ensemble, which is perhaps reasonable. We know that our ensemble was too warm in Greenland, so maybe it's also too warm in North America. Then once at 15,000 years ago, some of our runs jumped down like this, which just means the coefficients have been set in a way that allows this, and we hope we can remove these runs by history matching. And then it does catch up. It gets quite similar to the climate ensemble for a while. then allows a much wider range of temperatures in the last few thousand years. So that's what was happening in wave 1. Now we can add the wave 2 runs in this green. So you can see we have some improvement. We've reduced the spread of temperature in the first few thousand years by a couple of degrees at the lower end in each of these locations. And again, at wave 3, we also have a similar thing. We've got a couple of degrees cut down on the spread at each side in Alaska. We started ruling out some of these runs up here. Yeah, so basically after 3 waves, we started to constrain the boundary condition uncertainty that we have. Some of these runs that kind of look a bit weird, they're quite extreme. Well, this is because we're also varying the ice sheet parameters, so maybe there's settings of those that do mean that these are somehow feasible. So essentially what we've tried to do in this project is come up with a way of generating these really high dimensional boundary conditions just using a small number of coefficients. And doing so by using the information that we have from a small climate ensemble and our very sparse observational data. So the method we've used is try to overcome this sparsity. And then once we have this parameterization, we can do our normal things we do in computer experiments, and we can history match and emulate things based on jointly varying the ice sheet parameters and boundary condition. And then we start to remove some of the implausible runs of the ice sheet model, starting trying to zoom in on settings of the boundary conditions that do actually lead to reasonable deglaciations. And yeah, if we had more time, there's lots of things we could have improved. We could have added more coefficients to our model if we had more waves available. And of course, the more waves that we perform, the more we're zooming in to ice sheets that actually look good and now allow us to constrain the boundary conditions further. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions for our speaker? You mentioned that sometimes, after you run your waves, you said that sometimes this is correct for the wrong reason. Could you please be more specific on that point?
So these red lines. Do you mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so basically, they match well on the volume constraints that we used, and perhaps on some of the spatial constraints, but since we're not actually emulating the full output of the ice sheet model, because it's not really computationally possible. So therefore, to achieve this volume at this time, the spatial pattern of melting could be different from what actually happened. So, for example, in this run here, we haven't melted here, but we have started melting up here. So basically, yeah, the pattern of melting could just be incorrect.
And how did you select your error bars? How did you select where to locate them?
So this was basically from discussions with the paleo scientists we were working with. Getting the ice sheet right at the start is quite important. So if we want to start in the right place. And then we use this one because it's, well, a good constraint later on. We want it to pass through here. Things are starting to level off by then, so that's a good thing to hit. And then this one is there to try and catch the speed of the deglaciation. So a lot of these runs are just kind of starting to melt too late. So this one's here to try and trying to find whether we can actually have this melt in earlier as it's required.
Would anybody else want to question?
Yeah. So, how confident are you that you're actually analysing something that really happened in the past by a model that really tells you something that's happened in the past? I mean, it's a kind of a high-level question. Yeah.
I'm not really sure. I guess we have. I don't know if I exactly understand what you're asking.
I mean, the paleontologists put bars on for you, of course, but that's because that's what they do. It doesn't mean necessarily that those are the bars on actual things. And the models that you have, I mean, are pretty wildly speculative about what they
sure. Yeah, so I guess all of the paleo observations are themselves reconstructions from other things like fossil records. So, yeah, I guess perhaps there's more uncertainty there than we're actually led to believe. Maybe they're saying, well, we kind of feel it's somewhere in here, but in fact these could be much wider bars. There's also some temporal uncertainty, which we've not really looked at. All of the sort of extent records based on the moraines. We have, well, it's some sort of carbon data and all that type of thing, so we have some maybe plus or minus 100 years there. And this sort of thing could then mean, so as well as having uncertainty in this direction, we probably have uncertainty in this direction, which we haven't accounted for, but that would probably be something that would need doing.
And how about the model quality itself? I mean, because there's two questions you could ask. You say, is it possible for this model to reproduce the data? And if it does reproduce the data, does that mean we've found something scientific? Or do we just have a box of curves and we've found a curve that fitted?
Yeah, so it doesn't necessarily mean it'll be useful for anything. True. Yeah, I guess that's a question for the paleo community more. Not trying to deflect.
I'm asking you,
but in my
finding is about the community.
Yeah, so I think if you could keep doing it, if you could keep history matching, zooming on a space that actually, and you start getting ice sheets that kind of look good, you get good volumes, well, at that stage we'll have a space of plausible ice sheet model parameters and also the temperature records, so we could then actually put more effort into analysing which actual settings of parameters are giving us these good runs. Do these actually make sense, or are they just settings of the parameters that happen to fit? Because I think all of the parameters in the ice sheet model do have some sort of physical meaning. So I guess it could be that by pushing them to the edge of their range, that somehow makes things more actually work, whereas they might not actually believe they could truly take on those values. So yes, I think you're right, but it doesn't necessarily mean.
Just interesting,
Okay, no further questions. Let's thank our speaker. Thank you.